Okay, we are live. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett. I host these things. This week we're talking about red tape and bureaucratic inefficiency. Some of us read an article from the American Prospect where they interviewed two authors who recently wrote a book about administrative burdens called Administrative Burden. So we'll be looking at some quotes from that article. It's a Q&A. Sometimes bureaucracy is intentionally complex is the title of it. So I want to start with the question, which is what causes bureaucratic inefficiency and red tape? Is it inevitable to the extent that it's not inevitable, what can we do to minimize it, and where does basic income fit in? So just one simple question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. What causes it is complicated.
Yeah.
I guess I wish I had read this article, but it makes sense to me that like occasionally people would use it as a way to get what they want without being culpable. Like if something's really confusing and difficult to navigate and people are going to make predictable decisions based on that, that can be to your favor, I feel like, because it's not exactly clear that that was intentional, even if it is. So that could be one reason. But I think a lot of the time it has to do with like the difficulty of organization within a large complex structure, and probably also people wanting to hold people accountable, but then people thus like not wanting to get in trouble. So at least in specific examples, I can think of like a lot of red tape that has to do with that, or weighing very, very highly the cost of somebody cheating the system, maybe to the expense of efficiency, because like cheating is very salient, or like we really don't like someone to cheat the system. So for example, if you have grants, it might cost like way more to have all the oversight of the grants than people would ever cheat from the grants, but people don't maybe like the cheating, and so like you have all these people like oversighting and like all these different forms of fraud. So like I think that's sometimes where it comes from, is like really caring about whether people are cheating the system in some way. So I suppose it's probably different, but in different situations. But most likely just the complexity of really complex organizations where you don't have easy observability because it's a large social group. Something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know, there's kind of a rambling answer.
So when you say easy observability, you're talking about being able to recognize that someone is doing something correctly, following the appropriate procedure.
Like you can know when things are going well, when things are going poorly, when you should hold someone accountable, when somebody's cheating. Like in a small, relatively small group, it's hard enough to figure that stuff out in a small group, but it's a little bit easier, so you can usually do it without as much what we would call bureaucracy, like paperwork or other forms of trying to hold people accountable, or other kinds of institutions. But as it gets more and more complicated, just keeping track of what's happening, let alone dealing with people misbehaving, requires seemingly a lot of this stuff that then it also can be very time consuming and seemingly somewhat inefficient.
Any thoughts about how that relates to basic income?
Well, yes. I mean, basic income is an extremely straightforward policy. Everybody gets the exact same amount of money, like over a certain age. There's no other sort of qualifications or things to worry about or things to need to navigate or apply for. So it will have some bureaucratic difficulty in the ways that I was just describing, like what we're talking about people not signing up for multiple accounts or other kinds of things. But it's so simple relative to most policies that would minimize red tape. So that's usually more efficient. And I guess also, as we've talked about in here, like helps reduce intentional corruption, which is probably a little bit what this was sort of maybe angling at too. Because it's harder to like trade favors or do other strange things that manipulate a system that's that simple.
Okay.
Yeah, it was interesting to me to think about it being intentional, because I don't usually think of it that way. I think of it as being unnecessarily complex because people are involved. And for example, when I was doing technical writing, there had to be all these different levels of signature within the company, even though most of the signatures didn't care. I mean, the people signing didn't care about the document, and didn't even read it in some cases. But it was about a status quo, and it was about making sure that everybody, if they were asked later, said, "Oh yeah, I saw it," or "I signed it." So that was really about kind of, I think of the government that way in a lot of ways. The complexity of the organization having to do with people being involved who don't really have to be involved. but they want to say that they're involved, or it's a check off for part of their job description to be involved. So there's all that. And I think that creates a lot of complexity unnecessarily, but I hadn't really thought about intentional complexity, and that was interesting to me. And of course, it is. I mean, voting, the example of voting procedures was a great one, because there are intentional complexities designed to keep some people from voting, whole blocks of people from voting, and it succeeds in that. So the politics of bureaucracy were interesting. I hadn't thought about them before. Yeah, and I agree about basic income, that the simplicity of it, or relative simplicity, although you wonder how simple it will remain, if it can remain simple when it's in the hands of governmental agencies.
Yeah. So we're asking about bureaucratic inefficiency. Is it inevitable? And how does basic income fit in? Or to what extent is it inevitable?
The example that springs to mind is an article I read in the newspaper the other day about the casino that they're building. And is it Everett?
Everett.
Yeah.
And that the casino it's about to open, but the casino operator wants to sell it to a different company, but they have a casino in Springfield, and because of the rules, they would have to sell that one. And there were these quotes of the mayors of the two towns saying, whoa, wait a minute. We gave this company permission to have a casino in our town. So we're going to have to start over with the negotiation if you're going to talk about having that company run this casino. And a big part of it was, what about the jobs you guys promised us? What about the 1,200 jobs? It just, that struck me as an example of how, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking more of regulation, and I'm not clear on the difference really between regulation and bureaucracy, but I think that basic income would, if we lived in a world of basic income, there would be less motivation for some of the bureaucracy that we have. That example is a case.
Yeah. Okay. Steve?
I liked how the article talked about bureaucracy applications for services as if it serves no purpose at all except to be an obstacle, to be hoops to jump through. So that the person who's applying knows that whatever they're applying for, they definitely don't deserve it, but maybe they can prove they deserve it if they do the paperwork right.
Okay. Richard?
Well, they talked about abortion, how people would states would outlaw it outright. Well, they did that in Alabama last week and a number of other states recently, but they even stated that it's illegal. They know it's illegal, but they just wanted to get it to the Supreme Court so that their new Justice Kavanaugh can vote in the majority to outlaw Roe v. Wade and a number of other cases. And I think that bureaucracy is inevitable because they want to necessitate their existence so that they can keep expanding and have more employees and we want more jobs even though we don't really need more jobs.
Okay. Elizabeth?
So that sort of suggests that we would then inherently have less bureaucracy if we have like a basic income society then, right? One thing I appreciated in the article is they talked about Social Security and how that the government was really intentional about making that a less bureaucratic, easier process. That was sort of a nice story of hope of okay, sometimes the government can be really committed to doing a good thing and be like, we know that we need to lower the barrier to entry and we're willing to do a lot of work to create Social Security numbers, have ways to identify people to make sure that we can track all of their earnings and be able to pay them back for this thing because we've decided this thing is very important. We know that if we put it on the individuals, oh yes, keep track of all of your all of your, pay stubs and do all the math, and like that's
Right.
never going to happen, and there's going to be so much error, and so okay, like we the government will take the burden on us to do that. Was I don't have a lot of confidence that like any government in the 21st century would do that, but it was a nice story of hope of like, oh, okay, the government doesn't always try to do all of this terrible. Well, we don't really think people deserve it, so what if we make them go through 17 hoops?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mitchell on the live stream says, another thing to add is that when the administrative caseload is so great, they sometimes don't respond to anything, including giving them the paperwork they asked for. So sometimes it doesn't work even if you follow the convoluted procedures that have been put in place. So I think that it's an interesting question about whether bureaucracy is inevitable and what the sources of bureaucratic inefficiency are. So, there's this debate where some people say government, just because of how it is, because of all of the things it has to manage, it's going to be complex and inefficient in some ways, and we just have to live with that, or we have to find ways outside of the government to do some of these things, that kind of thing. Like that's a common argument. But then, there's a case to be made, I think a legitimate case to be made to say that, some of the things the government is doing, they could be doing more efficiently even as the government. And I think the Social Security example is a great example of that, because they made a conscious decision to make it more efficient.
They're talking about tax returns and how they're going to be able to, at some point, send to people what they estimate their taxes to be.
Right.
You can sign off on that, but you don't have to do all the work behind doing the tax returns.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example. It's one I've heard about for a while of kind of intentional inefficiency, that you have, H&R Block and TurboTax and all those people who, they're out of business if your taxes are simple, right? So they have this lobby and they petition the government to, keep the taxes complicated. Right?
Adam Ruins Everything has an episode about that, and how
What?
Adam Ruins Everything is just true television or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they actually have a free tax preparation thing, but it's really clunky and useless, so that people will want to buy TurboTax and things.
Right.
And the other countries actually have what they describe with this town in California, have that as a standard.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for Social Security, if they're tracking people's earnings over a lifetime anyway, then obviously they have the mechanism to track your earnings and then therefore what you're paying.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, right? Because your employer is already reporting all that stuff. So,
Why go through it twice?
Yeah.
I guess there's all the various deductions and things that affect your filing.
Right, but then the bulk of it can be done outside of you, and then you can tinker with the other parts.
Yeah.
Like if you run a business, that's more complicated. But
Right.
most people don't have
Yeah.
such complicated tax
Exactly.
returns.
Not to mention that they
Yeah.
could offer something like one of you said, like a similar program to TurboTax could be
Yeah,
free, and I guess they have one, but it's not very good.
Yeah, and I mean, free file's
Yeah.
not terrible,
Is
but
it
but
not?
there's
Yeah.
definitely the TurboTax lobby to be like, oh, we don't want anyone to know that if you make $66,000 a year or less, you can file your taxes for free. And,
right.
Right.
you can file federally for free, and at least in some states, you can file them for free. But
Yeah.
it's relatively. I don't find it to be any more clunky than when I use a pay service.
Really interesting. I'm reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as far as basic income goes, I think it's like you said, it's a very simple, straightforward policy. And I feel like much as with Social Security, it could be, if we decided to, it could be implemented in a very simple, efficient way with minimal red tape and minimal administrative burden for the people who are receiving it, or none almost. And I think anything that you do to make it more complicated and to kind of get in the way of it, I would say that doesn't even count as basic income anymore, because basic income is supposed to be this unconditional thing that everybody gets. You're not supposed to have to do anything in order to qualify for it, that
There
kind of
might be
thing.
citizenship requirements for that.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Obviously, I don't feel that should be
Right.
that's optimal, but certainly, in the kinds of proposals that they're talking about these days, there's a citizenship requirement. Yeah. So basic income on its own, it could it could be implemented without really any red tape, or just minimal amounts of red tape if you're testing for citizenship or something like that.
That kind of
so-
already, that red tape kind of already exists too, right?
What?
I just mean the mechanisms of figuring out who's a citizen.
Oh yeah, we've
Yeah.
got procedures in place for that. They could potentially be better, and we could have more efficient systems for giving people a path to citizenship and
I
all of
wasn't
that.
really
That
getting
gets
into all
complicated.
that. I
but
just
yeah.
meant it wasn't necessarily like added
Yeah.
that much.
So the overall point I'm trying to make here is that basic income itself doesn't necessarily require any red tape, any administrative burden. So to the extent that any of this other kind of really inefficient stuff is there to try to solve the problem that basic income solves, basic income can remove that administrative burden, can remove that red tape. So I think there are problems that basic income doesn't solve, and there might be bureaucratic inefficiency involved with that other stuff. But to the extent that these other government systems and programs and policies are solving the problem that basic income solves, basic income can make that more efficient, can make it go away. Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking of like different causes of bureaucracy, and like some of them have to do with just like the complexity problem, which you were talking about and I was talking about, and some of them have to do with things that other people brought up, like Joan and I think someone else too, like people having an incentive to kind of increase their own position or their own status by like sort of growing sort of jobs or growing their role in certain different kinds of activities that maybe they don't really need to have.
Oversight over oversight
Yeah.
over oversight.
Yeah.
And like sometimes it's actually really, really hard to know whether that's inefficient or efficient, because like it looks the same if you're hiring people because you're growing as an organization and you're doing really good things. And a lot of times, like I wonder about this. Well, like you work in the university setting, Elizabeth, and like Andrew Yang talks about, and I'm in university too, and like how a lot of the cost has come from increased administration actually. And it's kind of hard to know like if that is efficient or inefficient, because there's lots of like good things that are happening, and then also is it maybe just this way like people are thinking, oh, what I'm doing is important. I think it's kind of to your point about how it's hard to know like which jobs are kind of actually helpful or not in a specific case, because like each thing is sort of doing something useful, but it's kind of hard to know in aggregate whether it's become like way more than we need. So I think there's a lot of these ambiguous cases in addition to like the really clear cut like inefficient cases. And partly why I'm bringing all of this up is I'm wondering the degree to which a basic income would or would not affect this. Because on the one hand, we wouldn't have this need for jobs, which I think like Nick was maybe, I forget who said what, but like some of you were bringing up in the intro, like partly the fact that people want jobs or like need jobs might be part of what's making it even more likely that people agree to like take on all these new positions or see it as a good thing. On the other hand, like the human tendency to like want more importance, want more money, whatever, that's not going to go away just because of a basic income. So you might still see this bureaucratic creep anyway.
So I think there's two sides to this question you're asking. And one side is just in the economy in general, if we don't need to create jobs for people to have incomes, then how much of that job creation will disappear?
Right.
And then another side of the question is in terms of administering the basic income itself, how much complexity is there going to be? How many people are they going to try to hire? And I certainly think for that part of it, it's going to become so much more obvious how simple the system is and how simple it is to run and how it can be automated and all of that kind of stuff, that you're not going to be able to have any of this kind of like lack of information or people like not really knowing how useful something is or something like that, because you've simplified it so
I guess
much.
I wasn't interested in that second question as much as the first question of like how would a basic income affect other kinds of jobs and other kinds of, I guess, what could controversially be called like bureaucracy, or really uncontroversial like jobs that just don't need to be there.
Right. So how much of that is going to be left even if you have a basic income?
Yeah, exactly.
So
It's kind of interesting.
I don't know. That is an interesting question, and I think go ahead.
A
Richard.
lot of programs are under various proposals are going to be eliminated, like food stamps and things like that, because they would be combined into a basic income. And so those bureaucratic positions that oversee that will be eliminated as well.
Yeah.
And so those bureaucrats would want to latch on to basic income so they can, keep their jobs.
Yeah. Some of those
So I
jobs would be
think-
transferred into administering basic income somehow or other. Yeah.
I mean,
And-
maybe.
and maybe.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, too, the language and in forms, and also in
Yeah.
bureaucracy speak, and how difficult it is for people to get through that part of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, how you are administering basic income, really also, there's a big part of how it's going to be presented to somebody. How do they get it? A lot of people can't get services because they can't understand a lot of the language on those forms. It's just
Right.
simple. Because the forms are written in such a way that, you know, they're intentionally or unintentionally confusing.
So I guess there's a few questions here to ask. One of which is, why would we want to make the basic income forms, if there are even forms? Why would we want to make it intentionally complicated? And then another, I guess if you're
Yeah.
politically against basic income, then you might want to do that.
Yeah.
And then another thing to notice is that, or another question to ask is, how many people are entitled to Social Security payments who aren't getting it? And I think it's pretty small. I think Social Security is pretty reliable, and people are
One thing
pretty
that people,
straightforward and
the
simple.
two would have
Yeah.
in common is like everybody expects to get Social Security if
Yeah.
they pay into it. Everybody
Right.
would expect to get their basic income, so it wouldn't be this kind of thing where it's like, I don't know if I'm going to get say,
Right.
disability
And I
or
have
some
to
other program.
Go through all
And
of
I have to
this.
go through
Yeah,
all of
and read
this.
this. And
Exactly.
Although the Social Security guidelines and literature are also extremely confusing if you really want to, in Medicare, the
Yeah.
books that they send, I mean, I just throw them away. There's no way to read them.
Yeah.
But they're all there.
I guess, yeah.
And it might be that people feel they need to read those things to understand what they're getting into.
Yeah.
It could be.
And when you're entitled to money, one of the benefits of that is that you can pay someone with the money to figure all that stuff out
That's
for
true.
you.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
some extent.
Although
It's like healthcare, though,
Yeah.
in some ways.
I guess what I'm thinking here though is like, for the politicians who are supposed to be implementing it, like if certain people don't get certain benefits, it's not obvious that the program has failed. It's not clear who's supposed to be getting those benefits in the first place.
Yeah.
But if bunch of people are not getting their basic income,
Right.
and it's supposed to go to everybody,
Mhm.
the system is clearly set up poorly, and it's a lot
Right.
more. It's a lot easier to complain about that, right? Because it's like if you're supposed to give it to everyone and 30% of the population's not getting it, clearly that's a
Right.
problem. Whereas
Right.
right now, like, who's to say how many people are supposed to get food stamps or not? So if people are not able to fill out the forms and they're not getting it,
Right.
Right.
it's a lot harder
Yeah.
to say, like,
They
I
should
mean, you
be.
can make the
Right.
argument, but like you have to amass a lot more evidence to try to show that people who are supposed to get it aren't
Right.
getting it.
And another interesting
Yeah, yeah.
thing to note about some of these programs is that if everyone who was eligible for them actually got them, they might break the budget. You know, they might not be affordable in
Right.
terms of like revenue neutral, that kind of thing anymore.
Yeah.
Because they've kind of factored in how much it costs when you're administering it in kind
Yeah.
of the
And
status
that could
quo
be
way.
totally unconscious.
Yeah.
They could just even be like basing it on past years,
Yeah.
you know, but that's got built into it, like how
Yeah.
difficult it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So if everybody, you know, who qualified for food stamps got food stamps, you know, there might be some concern that it's unaffordable, or
Right.
we can't, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
we can't
And
fund
that's
it
part of
anymore.
the-
Like with the budget
Discouragement,
shutdown
right.
this year, there was a scare over how many, not having enough money for food stamps because of they were run out by a certain date or whatever.
Right. Did they talk about job applications in there too? Well, anyway,
I don't think they talk
one
about job
example that you
applications.
bring up a
Yeah.
lot is like oftentimes there's also like so many candidates for a job that are basically qualified, and like it's really resource intensive to go through all of them. So sometimes different kinds of, I don't know if it's, sometimes different kinds of bureaucratic difficulties or like needing to fill out forms the right way and that kind of thing acts as a kind of screen just to like reduce the effort that you have to go through.
Right,
But there's
yeah.
there are algorithms for going through jobs, but there's concern over their being biased against women and minorities. and things.
Right.
Because the people who created them are biased against women and minorities.
Right, or they're
Yeah.
based on like the current
Right.
employees or something like that, right?
Yeah. I think any time you have to filter people out, you know, it's very likely that these kinds of biases will emerge.
Yeah.
It's hard to eliminate them, and especially if you have like your example with a lot of people qualifying for the same job. It's not, like, even if you make it perfectly fair, there are still some people who are losing who shouldn't necessarily be losing out.
Just
And that's
that they don't
especially
have the
true.
job. Yeah.
Right. Like, and that's if you're kind of the view that, everyone should have a job and people deserve jobs and that kind of thing. I don't fall into that camp, but, you could apply the same thing to a benefit program. Like if some people are not able to get food stamps because they're filtered out by the administrative burden, then there might be, maybe you've eliminated all the biases and it's completely fair who gets filtered out. I think that's unlikely, but let's say you did, you still have a problem because they should be getting it.
Yeah. With grant applications too, I think sometimes it's kind of an interesting mix. So like you have to put in like a ton of effort, which is partly like a costly, like it's partly showing that you're invested, which is something that they care about, even though it is bureaucracy. So that's another thing that the bureaucracy can show. But
Right.
it's also like showing that maybe you come from a school with like people who can help you with that, which is also maybe something that they care about, but wouldn't want to say that they care about, or maybe not what they care about. But it's also, like I said, just a way to like screen the applications. So sometimes the bureaucracy is like, I guess my point there mostly is, in addition to the bias point that you were bringing up, is like sometimes the effort is something that they're looking for, and this is just a way to show, a very obnoxious on the part of the other person, like way to show that you're like willing to put in a lot of effort.
Would there be
that
an
you care about the
incentive
thing.
from the government's part to discourage people from applying for basic income? I mean, that's one thing to think about.
Right.
It wouldn't be something you'd apply for.
Well, then, let's talk about the distribution.
Yeah.
You know, how it would happen. It might be digital cryptocurrency, I don't know,
Right.
something, which also
Well, it's
is
probably not
challenging
going to be
for
probably
some-
not going to be cryptocurrency.
Okay, I know you
Yeah.
don't like that. But let's say it's like a PayPal system. Or some sort of technological payment system. A lot of people
Yeah, like
don't
direct
know how
deposit.
to do that. A lot of people in America don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't have bank accounts. Yeah.
That's another thing. And
Well,
we
that's
talked about that
mainly what you're
before
talking about, right? If you can't get a
Yeah.
direct deposit if you don't have a bank account.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's like a not a direct administrative burden, but there's these little kind of sidebar
But-
administrative burdens.
But then the question is, do the people who don't have bank accounts, do they get Social Security? And I think they get checks and
Yeah,
they cash them, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, you could implement it that way. You could also, I mean, like, if you are paying for, there's no reason why the government shouldn't be able to provide just a default bank account for everyone, a government bank account, at the central bank. Obviously that would involve changing, how the banking regulations are and, how the whole
Yeah.
system works and everything. But there's no resource constraint that preventing the government from ensuring everyone has a bank account.
You sent me that article about how they could have it at the Fed.
Yeah.
And they would compete with the regular banks and have them force up their interest rates, and how they would have instantaneous transfers between accounts instead of having to wait 3 days or whatever it is.
Yeah, this is the Morgan Ricks proposal that I sent you, I think. That is
I
name?
don't know. But
Yeah.
Couldn't they also like partner with, I don't know, a company like PayPal? I don't know if PayPal has like a credit card or a way that you can actually spend the money, but
Yeah, I mean, the question is how do you ensure that people actually have access to the basic income?
Right.
And we were talking about a few weeks ago, I think when we were talking about India,
Yeah.
we were talking about like the
Right.
last mile problem where you can
Right.
pay everyone the basic income,
Yeah.
but then the question is how do they access those funds?
Right.
How far do they have to travel?
Pesa thing that they have in Kenya.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think these are problems that are out of the realm of being able to be solved. Yeah.
But getting a bank account may be a bureaucratic mess for some people. I mean, it's not basic income per se, but it's actually setting up a bank
Yeah.
account.
So I mean, there's
wait, sorry, can I ask an
Yeah.
honest question? Why is it hard for people to get a bank account if they're going to get a basic income? Like, I understand that there's fees or they might not have money right now, but
Yeah,
What are
I
the
mean, I
barriers
feel
to
like
getting
if
a
you
bank
know if you know that everyone's going to get a basic income and you're the bank, there's not really any reason.
right.
Not
I guess I'm
to
wondering
provide
why you
people
couldn't
with a
just
bank
waltz
account.
into whatever the closest bank is and get a bank account, no problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think today it can be tricky for
Because
some
they do all
people.
the forms that you need, like the forms of identification.
Yeah.
It's
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
difficult. It's complicated.
Right.
You can do it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's complicated. You have to
Right.
sit with somebody, at least now,
Yeah, yeah.
and go
I
over
kinda
all
forgot
your
about that.
assets or
But we
whatever.
signed up for
Yeah.
Ally Bank online like really fast.
Yeah, but they were able to check that we
Had
were.
other bank accounts? or
Yeah,
something?
and we submitted documents online, I think, as
Right.
well.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, like, it seems really simple and straightforward if you have all this stuff right in
Right.
front of you. And
No,
just,
of course.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to get
Yeah.
a sense of like what the barriers are.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
yeah. I mean, it's administrative burden,
And if you
largely.
don't have a
Yeah,
bank account, you've never had a bank account, then there's more of a demand from the
Right.
part of the bank. Okay, they know you might have a basic income, but how do they know that you're not gonna keep overdrawing it?
Oh,
You
I see.
know,
Right.
they have their own
That's their-
I think
sense
it's
of.
I think it's less that, and I think it's more like anti-money laundering regulations, and you know, like know your customer or that kind of thing. Yeah, because the banks are subject to pretty strict rules in terms of keeping track of who their customers are and how the money is flowing and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Think about like a kid trying to open a bank account. For some people, that's a similar situation, that if they've never had a bank account. If you're
Yeah.
illiterate, you know, if you've grown up in a community where that's not
Yeah.
how things work.
So basic income, I mean, like, basic income doesn't necessarily require that people have bank accounts in the way that we normally think of them. It could be everybody just gets a card that's like your social security card, and you can take it to
Merchants.
a basic income ATM and get cash out or something like that.
Or it could be a
Um,
bank account that's only for your basic income, so that you know no money is going to be laundered, and then like maybe it requires less identification.
I don't know, only for your basic income? Like, you can't put money into it, you can only take it out?
Yeah,
what you're
theoretically,
saying?
if it was such a barrier that people, yeah, that could be a possibility.
Okay.
There was actually a proposal like that, and then there's one day where you have to spend it all in a single month, or else it gets recycled back into the system or something.
That was the Italy one, right? I think, yeah. I think that in the Italy one, they said if you don't spend it, you lose it. Which I think is
that. We were reading about that.
is kind of silly.
But yeah, I mean, I think my bank account you can't put money into. I guess it's basically just a version of your card, like
Right.
yeah.
The credit card.
But you just have like a debit card. Don't even need to really think of it as an account.
Yeah, well, your social security account, it only has one purpose, and you know, if you have a life insurance and like that, it only has one purpose. You can do general banking.
Right. Yeah, so you could have something like that.
Yeah.
Or at least as an option for those people who don't have bank accounts.
Yeah. I mean, I think once we have basic income in place, this is not going to be a hard problem to solve. And the question is, does anyone have an incentive to prevent it from being solved efficiently?
Yeah.
Some people might.
Some people might, there might, maybe there's a whole new industry of people who, get paid to help people figure out their basic income or something. And your clients are going to have money because they have a basic income, that kind of
Also
thing.
the political climate. I mean, if Andrew Yang wins, obviously that would be one thing you want to do, but I'm sure there'd be plenty of people who were against it, who would not want that to happen and would create obstacles for it to happen.
Yeah.
The administration of it.
I mean, I think you're right, but again, I would look back to Social Security, and there were plenty of people who were against it. It was very controversial, and certainly there have been various barriers put up and various complexities added to it, but it's also been kept to a point where everyone can still get it.
Right.
Like my great grandfather, he had a bakery, and he didn't want to hire any employees because he didn't want to have to pay their Social Security. So he had his family members
Yeah.
to like haul the lard up from the cellar and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, I guess basic income won't have that particular problem. Yeah.
I had a question. Do we think that any large corporations have managed to avoid their own bureaucracy and
Yeah, that's a
red
good
tape?
question. I was wondering about corporations too. Yeah.
Because they want to be lean and mean,
Right.
and
Yeah.
Yeah. And
working at like the Walmart or Amazon, working on profiting on small margins.
that lean and mean is always used just before layoffs. That's the way they get lean and mean. They get rid of people. But not the regulations and all the stuff that it comes with.
Well, it depends. Sometimes they do that too, right? Like, I think Amazon in particular has a very they have an efficiency mindset where they really try to keep everything streamlined and are always figuring out how to streamline more. And I read about kind of how the Amazon Web Services emerged, and originally, they were having all these problems with the Amazon bookstore because it was getting too big and all of that, and they started developing this technology, and then it had problems, and then they had to iterate on that, and they've kind of modularized their business, and then each component of it tries to be kind of really efficient at what it does and that kind of thing. But there are certainly big businesses that are not as efficient.
Insurance companies are a great example.
Yeah, I'm thinking like IBM.
IBM.
General Electric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The prediction would generally be like the more competition you have, the less inefficiency you would have, right? In a field, wouldn't that be?
Yeah. But the question is,
But the
Yeah.
government like provides incentives to become inefficient so they can provide more jobs.
Well, that's part of
Yeah.
like
That's
what I
true
wanted
too,
to
yeah.
raise too. Like back to my earlier question
Right.
about how a basic income might or might not affect these kinds of inefficiencies. So like Alex talks about how if it's like really easy to borrow as a business, like maybe you're not required to be as like lean and mean, at least for a while.
right.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the government trying to create unnecessary jobs, if we have basic income and we start to move past this mindset of everyone needs to get an income from a job, then that certainly takes away a lot of the incentive to do that.
Yeah.
A lot of the incentive to make the economy do that. So then the question is, what reasons would we have left to make up useless jobs, or to keep them going?
Yeah. Well, some of the ones were the ones I was mentioning before. Like each
Yeah.
individual within the company gets more like status and maybe a raise if they have people working under them or they're involved in more things. So like,
Right.
there still is that incentive to grow
Yeah.
maybe beyond what's like super efficient.
Right.
So I think there's probably going to always be some of that, and this kind of gets back to Steve's question, where
Right.
if you are a big company and maybe you're not directly subject to competition, under what conditions are you going to still
Yeah.
try to be really efficient?
I guess the way I'm kind of imagining it is like there's these forces towards inefficiency. Like first of all, it's just really hard to figure out how to be efficient the bigger you get. And second, I mean, you are more efficient the bigger you get in some ways, but to have all these little things be efficient is really hard. And then second, are all these like social incentives to get bigger as well. And like you kind of need forces acting in the opposite direction to curtail those.
But
Well, if you-
about it.
with the first part with they actually hire companies to look over your company
consulting
to
companies, yeah.
work,
Right.
like get rid of all the inefficiencies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They do that.
Yeah.
Which is one way they kind of find to do
So
that, yeah.
so another way that this can be this type of inefficiency can be reduced is through monetary tightening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if a company is inefficient and they can't borrow very easily anymore
Right.
because interest rates are higher, then they're going to have to figure out something. There's a stick there that's going to punish them for being inefficient.
Right.
And we see the opposite of this in some places. If you guys have heard of zombie companies, they have a big problem with this in Japan, but I think it's kind of everywhere, where there are companies that are not really viable businesses, but they just keep going and going because money is so cheap that they can keep rolling over their debt. They can keep borrowing more and more and more, but they wouldn't be viable companies in an efficient economy,
Right.
and they just kind of keep going. So the opposite of that is that you have monetary tightening where interest rates are higher, and those types of companies can't survive anymore.
Yeah.
They just go out of business. Or you can it's a continuum, right? Like zombie companies are over here, and then the most efficient company in the world is over here, and then you can use monetary policy to say like, okay, we're cutting off here. Anyone who's less efficient than what would be able to survive at this interest rate is no longer going to be in business. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, just to say though about those consultants that come in and look at the business, sometimes that's just a checkoff item. I mean, we had at Leslie somebody coming in and gave a lot of recommendations about how to make things run better, and all these, it was, I don't know, more than 100-page report. That was it. That was done. And then we just went on the way we were.
So that can be another example of inefficiency too,
Yeah.
right? This is very similar to the idea of having more administrators, right? Who are each
Yeah.
one is there
Right.
to help part of the system work better, but then in aggregate, you're like, wait a minute, why do we have all these people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is kind of related. Like,
And you really can't find the one.
Yeah. Well, this is like you give a bigger sort of a level up analysis of what Andrew Yang points out, which is like universities don't really compete on price that much. and so they
Right.
don't really have a big incentive to like
They're
cut
like
down costs
they're
in
like
various
insurance
ways.
companies or
Which
nonprofits.
is to say, like, if everybody who's hired is adding like a bit of value
Right.
and they're not competing on price, like it is worth hiring those people and they're making it a better environment for the students, but just maybe not that economically efficiently.
Right. Yeah, well, it's odd to think about efficiency in relation to universities
Right.
and in faculty,
Mhm.
you know.
Well, what
But-
even your outcome, like it is a weird thing, like what are
Yeah.
you selling and what's your
Right,
stuff like
yeah.
that.
Who's
But-
the customer?
But
Student,
the
I
students
guess,
are generally not choosing. Well, some people choose like cheaper places, but often it's not
Yeah.
as
It's not
much as
about
other kinds of
right,
products, and
right.
so like
You're gonna pay
Yeah.
whatever it takes to get into the best school possible, or a lot of
people.
a lot of
Yeah.
parents and prospective students are thinking that
as
way.
we've seen.
Yeah.
Right, and it's possible to think in that way largely because you have sources of financing that are able to at least get you through college, and
That's
then
part of it,
in terms
yeah.
of what you have to worry about after
Even
that,
like
you
college
know.
loans and
Yeah.
financial aid and stuff like
Yeah,
Yeah.
Government subsidized,
Right.
or government insured,
And then
loans
there's
and that
that
kind of
student
thing.
admissions scandal like a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
With like we'll pay you $500,000 to get our child in there, even though they don't deserve to go in there. But then there's the whole Jared Kushner got into Harvard because his father bought a building or something.
Yeah, I mean it's not really that clear of a distinction between what's okay to do and what's not in terms of what you get in trouble for and what you don't, because it's all kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess. I mean,
What do you mean?
well, I think there's a big line between paying directly to blackmail somebody to get your child into school.
You mean
Yeah.
bribe?
Yeah, bribe. I mean, not
Okay.
blackmail, bribe.
Yeah.
And getting in because you're a legacy child or whatever those other reasons are. I do think.
So
Okay.
there are multiple arguments. One of which
Yeah.
is that the university makes a calculation when it comes to people who make large donations about like
Yeah.
how much financial aid they can give to other students if
Right.
they accept this person.
Right.
Whereas they're not. So from the university's perspective, they're losing power if they're being lied to. Because these students are just, the other students in the admission scandal, they were just lying about their credentials. So the university
Right.
isn't really getting anything out of it. From the university's perspective.
Right. The university would prefer
would
that
rather
you
be
bribe
bribed
them
themselves.
directly.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
By the university, not the fencing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah,
They
yeah.
bribe me.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, but certainly from the university's perspective, they're very different, right?
Yeah,
the university isn't getting that benefit. They're just getting lied to.
Right,
And,
yes.
and the other,
Yeah.
someone else is getting that benefit.
That's true.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. But the
Practically.
students, my students were like, it was an interesting debate we had in the class because like the argument is that they use that money for other good things or something.
The really interesting sideline of
Yeah.
this is that
Yeah.
people say, well, what about when that child gets into the school and they're not really qualified?
I
How do
know,
they do
yeah.
the work? Well, that just tells you that how many unqualified people are in the school already that really can't do the work or shouldn't be there. I mean, there are plenty of people in Yale and Harvard and that are there and they're getting C's, they're getting by.
Or maybe that really anyone could do it, and
right?
it's just a matter of like
Yeah.
credentialing and all
Yeah,
that.
right.
There are students who fail out of these stuff.
Yeah,
Oh,
there are
well,
some
sure.
who can't.
It's not
That's
true.
for sure, but more
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
you think can do it.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
depends.
Yeah.
Like, I think
Yeah.
especially, I can only speak to like Harvard where I grade the students, but like most of the students do really well. And so like a student who wasn't able to do it
Right.
would, like you said, just be getting poorer but passing grades.
Like George Bush.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you're like, it depends on how poor or quality
Right.
the work was, I
Right.
guess.
Right.
But like, there could be
It's
a big
still-
decrease, and they would
Mhm.
look, their grades would be a lot lower than everyone else's, but
Yeah,
they
but
might
they'd
be
still
passing.
graduate.
Yeah, they might be graduating. Yeah.
Then they're a Harvard grad.
That'd be interesting. Yeah, I guess it's hard to know. I'm not sure how much less qualified these people were too.
Right.
Because
Yeah, I
as
know.
Alex
Yeah.
was pointing out, like they
Right.
might have. It's not really obvious. Not that they didn't have some kind of reasonable shot, and really the parents just want them to like
Yeah.
have. I don't really know.
I think
have a more
somebody's
certain
daughter
shot.
really didn't have a reason.
Oh, really? I didn't look into the details. Yeah.
Didn't at all. But the other thing about the university is the bureaucracy that grows around making it attractive to
Right,
students.
exactly,
You
yeah.
know, the food is great, the
Right.
dorm rooms are luxurious, and all the money is going into these types
Right.
of things that really don't have to do with learning.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
A sports stadium.
And also don't have to do with price. So it's like Alex's
Yeah.
point that they're competing on dimensions other than price,
Right,
maybe other than learning.
right. They're
Yeah.
attracting customers
Right,
too.
right.
I mean, the students are customers. Yeah.
Yeah. And the biggest thing I think is like the reputation of the school, which because the students want that sort of
Yeah.
degree themselves.
Right.
Yeah. Which is a little bit different from the learning.
Right. So, I mean, it's hard to
It's
think about
correlated.
just efficiency in some in some areas. That's what I'm getting at. That's what we're
Right.
getting at.
Hard
Yeah.
to think about just efficiency.
I mean, the efficiency of a corporation, or, I mean, a university is kind of the same.
Yeah, it is.
Well,
hard.
yeah, it all depends on what you want the
what your outcome
corporation to do or what you want
Yeah,
the university
exactly.
to do.
is. Right.
If the university is trying to maximize the number of really good students they
Right.
get, then they're measuring efficiency based on that outcome.
Or maybe
And if-
just the number
yeah.
of students. Enrollment is a
Usually,
big
I mean,
issue.
like, I know that that's an issue for your program.
And many MFA programs.
And many MFA programs. Yeah, I think that's right. I think when we typically think of universities, though, they're always rejecting some number of students. They're not worried about filling all the seats most of the time,
Right.
and they just want to get the good students. Yeah.
Right. And that's like an interesting question too. Like I often wonder, like what are they trying to get? Are they trying to get, like, obviously they're trying to get the good students, but within that, are they somehow trying to get people who will be donors in the future, who like improve their reputation by achieving things? It's probably like kind of a mix.
Yeah.
And who make it such that when you go there as another student, maybe a student of a famous person, you're surrounded by a lot of really smart people and it seems like an impressive place. You know, they're kind of selecting probably on all these different things.
I mean, all the things we're talking about, basic income won't have those kind of conditional things going on. It seems like a lot of the bureaucracy grows around that, about
Right.
conditions and whether
Yeah.
you meet those standards or conditions.
Yeah.
Like in Wisconsin and places like that, in like southern places, they actually have like drug testing programs. Even though the drug testing, they have like only less than 1% of the people are disqualified because they use drugs. So
For the
and
for
so
like
that-
a food stamps or something?
Mhm. and so it costs more for some of the programs. It costs more to run the drug tests than to
Right.
actually give out the.
Well, this
Yeah.
is kind of
Yeah.
related to my point about like people really caring about the cost of like cheating. I mean, I would put that almost in
Yeah.
that category. I don't agree with this, but like some people think like, oh, like you're taking our money and like going off and cheating with it by using drugs or whatever. So like because of that, they'll pay more than it's worth by far. Like even if there's a tiny chance. You see this in like, well, my advisor always complains about this with like grant oversight too, but you see this a lot, like the perception of like cheating like that being so bad that people will throw a ton of money after it. That doesn't really seem worth the benefit.
Right. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
but drug testing might be a little different than that concern. The stigma of it and inefficiency in the workplace and all of that stuff.
I think we're talking about drug testing for receiving social benefits.
benefit.
Oh, okay.
Like-
like
I was
food
thinking
stamps.
about EMC where they did drug testing, and they had to drug test everybody because they wanted to just do drug testing for the people who worked in manufacturing, because they assumed that they would be on drugs more. But then they couldn't because that would be discriminating against
Right.
those people. So everybody who applied there had to get drug tested at every level, executives and everybody.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, it is weird.
Yeah, I think for drug testing for social programs, well, I want to make 2 points here. The first point is just that I think people who are addicted to drugs probably,
Really
you know,
need those
like
social programs.
really need those social
Yeah,
programs.
exactly.
And then the second point is that you know, the statistics that you see in terms of the number of people who failed the drug test, they might be smaller than the number of people who would fail if everyone
Took it.
if everyone took the drug test, because some people maybe they don't even apply for the programs because they know they're going to fail the
Exactly.
test.
That's a really good point.
So so you might not be accurately measuring the costs of
In terms
screening
of people
people.
being excluded. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
That's a really good point.
And then
Right.
there's this like joke that the guy uses his wife's urine, and it's like, congratulations, your wife is pregnant.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You're pregnant, rather.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah. Anyone have any more comments before we get to the article?
I think we already discussed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to get to the article. I guess
Yeah.
maybe at the very end we can go back around to this
Yeah.
question of like,
Oh,
would a
and-
basic income reduce bureaucracy? How much? That kind of thing.
And
I
there's
guess-
another example of how a basic income can be implemented. It's like in Oregon, you're automatically enrolled in voting, and so you get absentee ballots. And well,
I didn't know
and
that
like-
about Oregon.
in like Massachusetts and things, you actually have to go to voting, and you have to apply to get absentee ballots.
Yeah.
In Oregon, all ballots are mail-in ballots,
Interesting.
Yeah. and that's why it takes forever to get the results from Oregon. We're always waiting for Oregon. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How funny.
Yeah.
I didn't know voter registration was like by default.
Yeah.
In Oregon. Yeah, I didn't know that either. That's pretty cool.
Mhm.
It's weird kind of that it isn't everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, why do we register to vote?
I know.
Why isn't it just
Why do
obvious
you
that
keep
you can
asking
vote?
us?
I never really thought about it before, but it doesn't really make sense.
It's
Because
because
they
they don't
get black
voter
people and poor
suppression.
people.
Yeah, right. I mean,
Who
other
wants
than
that?
this, like, what's
Yeah.
the reason you could have for not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of administrative burden.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you're
Yeah.
automatically in Social Security, for
Right.
example. Why wouldn't you automatically be a voter?
Right.
Everyone is supposed to be a voter.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, it's hard to argue that you can't automatically do it for one program when you're clearly automatically
Yeah.
doing it for
Right.
another
Right,
program.
and like you're not
Yeah.
forced to vote. You can still not show up.
Right.
Right.
It just means you
Right.
can.
Yeah, but in
Also,
Australia and places
yeah.
like that, you have to pay a tax. if
There
you
are
don't
some
vote.
places where you have to vote. That's like another level of getting people to vote
Yeah.
with a fine or something. But like it doesn't really make sense that you even have the registration step.
I wonder if it has to do at least partly with people need to decide what party they want to register for.
Oh yeah,
Each
the
time.
party.
Each
Yeah,
time.
well, when they register, you have to like declare, or you can declare
But couldn't you be a
that you're not.
default registered as an independent? But maybe
Maybe.
it did stem from something like
Yeah.
that. And also like where
Yeah,
you
where-
live, so that you know
Yeah.
like where your polling location is.
Yeah.
That is very
Yeah.
helpful because then
Right.
they have your name on a list. And actually, like in Massachusetts, you don't need any ID to vote, which is great, but also always kind of shocks me considering how much you need ID for everything else. So they do kind of have to know that you're supposed to go to that polling station, and then they have your name on a list,
Right.
like to related to
That's
your
true.
address.
You don't give an ID.
Yeah, you don't.
And I think that's true in most states that you don't have to give an ID.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is to make
Yeah.
it easier.
Yeah.
Right.
And in
Yeah.
theory, you could make it so that there's multiple polling places and everyone just has a master list, and you could just
That's
be like,
true.
I'm a person who lives in this state. Like in theory.
But how do they know you don't go to one and then go to the other?
Because when you go to one, they cross it off in the database
Oh,
that everyone
if it's
has access to.
electronic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm guessing this stems from an earlier era because they actually like have it
Yeah.
on a little piece of paper.
Yeah,
yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah,
you could.
So-
in 2019, I'm
You could,
that
yeah,
we could,
you certainly
we could move
could.
beyond
You
like
could. the
these
piece of
canned
paper
copies.
that someone.
So I mean, I think that's another good point that a
Really
lot
good
of this bureaucratic inefficiency is left over from
Yeah,
when this was the only way you could do it.
there is a lot of inertia.
yeah.
That's a really good point. We haven't really talked about that
But
yet.
then we've got kind of these entrenched practices,
Yep.
and we've got systems that depend on things being the way they are, and
Yep.
people's jobs depending on things being the way they
Right.
are.
And just like a
Yeah.
big startup cost, like switching, which then makes things more efficient. But like you have to overcome
Sure.
you have to garner the resources for that hurdle.
Yeah.
But I feel like kind of to Steve's point earlier, I feel like there are some businesses that are much better at saying, okay, we're going to pay for the efficiency now and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and upgrade, and then there are some businesses that aren't.
Right.
And I think I wonder what under what conditions it people feel motivated to actually to make the upgrade.
There's probably like
yeah.
a cultural component to this too, like people copying each other, learning from each other. Like I know the Silicon Valley culture has its ups and downs and it has certain features, and other business cultures probably have other features.
Yeah, I think that's some of it, but I don't think that's the main thing.
I think it's more like a facilitator or a hamperer. Like it's not. I guess my thing it's like it's not an
Yeah.
easy problem to solve. So if you have companies around you that are figuring these things out, then that can help you learn how to do it.
I think custom
Yeah.
is a big
What is
custom.
customs?
What
Yeah.
people are using.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
My brother was talking about how last year he was the project manager for this backup program. So because they back up everything they do for the day, so that they don't have to keep looking. Have to spend weeks going back for each lawsuit. Because if lawsuits, you have to produce all the documents that are related to the things.
Oh yeah.
So with for a certain what you were working on for the case, so he worked on this like backup program, so that they could just like, oh, we'll just send you everything that we did on each day for the past however long we were working on this case.
Yeah, that makes sense.
No, I mean, there was a huge cost to companies when they were switching to computer systems. I mean,
Right.
going
exactly.
from,
yeah.
paper when I worked in an insurance company, and then they were computerizing all that. But they had to because of competition. I mean,
Right.
it was really about that. It was really
And-
for them about money.
Yeah.
And a lot of hospitals and stuff are just doing that now. Yeah.
Right? Isn't that insane?
Yeah.
Because
And, like, the
they didn't
voting still
have
isn't
to.
doing that.
They didn't have to. There
That's
was
right.
no
Right.
competitive pressure. They wouldn't.
Right.
You know, the hospital isn't going to be driven out of business by another hospital. You know,
Yeah.
putting in more efficient procedures, that kind of
Right.
thing. So I think that's
Yeah.
more of what I was getting at. I think it's more that than just culture and kind of custom. I think there's
I
got
guess
to be.
I thought you were
cost.
asking the question
Yeah.
like among things that seem to have equal levels of like competitive pressure. Well, like you mentioned IBM, for example. I don't know much
Yeah.
about why IBM would be less efficient than like another computer company. Maybe it's already like so established, it doesn't need to be, something like that. Like there's other things going for it.
Yeah, they've got like established enterprise customers and things like that. Like, you know, they know they're not going to lose their customers because they've built up these kind of entrenched relationships and that kind
Right.
of thing. But I do think that in the long run, they kind of are losing out on some
Right, it
business.
just takes
by-
long. You can
yeah,
kind of coast for a while.
yeah,
Well, government is kind of an example of
Yeah.
something
Yes.
that's not subject to that kind of competition.
yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And an example that comes to my mind is that, I mean, I moved to Massachusetts within the last few years, and it always surprises me that you can't get like a 6-pack of beer in the grocery store. Right? I mean, a lot of other places you live, that's just crazy.
Right. That's
But I think it's just because it's what people are used to here.
Yeah.
And it just seems like, oh,
Well, I mean,
Well,
that
some
was,
places-
alcohol in
I
the
mean, well-
grocery store?
well, because that was
There
like
might
laws
be
in the 19.
depravity.
I mean, that was
Yeah.
laws in the 1980s after there was a really public like drunk driving accident. I forget what the details of the
Oh,
case were.
interesting.
Like we like to say it's blue laws, but it's from the 1980s.
Interesting.
Oh, really?
That like
That's a myth.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And they
Thought
have
about that.
they have changed it recently in the past few years. I think now the rule is that each supermarket chain
have one.
can have five
Five?
stores that
Oh.
sell wine and beer.
Stop
Yeah.
Russia doing it.
Yeah, because
Bureaucracy.
like some of the Trader Joe's you can get
Exactly.
like,
Right,
Yeah.
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 like
It's
the
only-
Men Drive one.
Only 5 of each chain, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Right.
the smaller chains, all of them have it, and then the bigger ones, hardly any of them do. Yeah.
Well, there
Right.
was that whole, the email thing with Hillary and her talking about using that computer and what they had to do to update it and how, they didn't, the government is not computer savvy. I mean, it was pretty
Yeah.
clear from all her descriptions.
When she was
that-
talking about her email server?
Yeah.
Yeah.
her server. She really didn't know what she was doing.
Right.
It was pretty clear. But everybody attributed nefarious, she lost all those emails on purpose. And she really, it seemed like she didn't know and she didn't have enough technical guidance to figure it out.
There's a late last year they were talking about how the Veterans Bureau wasn't getting the benefits to the people before Christmas or whatever, and they were using a computer from the late '60s
Yeah.
From the
for
late
millions
60s.
of accounts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think
Did
this-
it have vacuum tubes, or was that post vacuum tubes?
Yeah, right. My dad would be excited about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, to your point, Nick, like, I mean, I guess this is the classic thing. Like, people like to bring up, like, the DMV, right? Like, places that are just really efficient, don't really have any competition. So, like, they don't really
Right.
have
Although
people.
they've gotten a lot better now. You can
Yeah,
go
so
online.
on the flip side, it's, like,
Yeah.
interesting that, like, so the competition, I guess, is that you can get voted out. But maybe, like, so that's presumably what's supposed to put some pressure on the government to be useful and good.
Yeah.
In that sense. But, like, I agree, it's not usually as efficient in a certain
Well,
sense.
that's what was making me think of it in terms of like a cultural thing,
Right.
right? It's like I think the representatives in Massachusetts are probably doing what their
I
constituents
see,
want.
right, and it's
which
actually
is
what the constituents
no beer in the
want.
grocery store.
Yeah. So in that sense, that's not inefficient for this from the perspective of what the people want, in a way. Depends on
I
what
just
you
want
count
to
as
be able
efficient
to
or
tell them,
inefficient,
make
right.
them see.
Yeah.
Life could be so much better and easier.
Right.
It's like the parallel like representative democracy. Is that, like,
Yeah, exactly.
it's inefficient to have the people vote on literally everything, but then where is your line about
Yeah.
like what things? Because there's so much stuff, like there's so many bills that get voted on or voted committee or whatever, like every day.
Right.
And like if you get on one of those email lists, it's like, oh, here's how your representative voted on it. You're like,
Right.
she just voted on like these 7. I don't even know what these are.
Yeah, exactly.
And so where's the balance? Because representatives will be like, oh yeah, like I'm going to say that I'm really excited with this new bill I'm putting forward about this platform that I
Yeah.
campaigned on. But they're voting on 49 other
Exactly.
things. It's usually only if you're like, oh, I
Yeah.
really care about this particular issue, and so I'm on, some legislative advocacy group is like, hey, there's, this bill about like, restorative justice in Massachusetts, and like
Right.
you should call your rep and have, tell them to like vote for it. but there's 49 other bills
Right,
about different things, and unless you are plugged into something about that, you're not gonna know. Or I mean, I guess if you're like retired or super bored or something, you're like, I'm gonna go through all the bills that are currently pending and read them and contact my rep.
But even if you did, like, you might not have the expertise.
Right.
So I think they do a really good job in Massachusetts. When you do vote on things independently, they have arguments pro and con, and they have and I read that really carefully, and I do my best. And there's only a few of them, so you can research in advance. And I think those are good. But like at the same time, like, even there, I'm often like, well, I'm not sure about all the consequences. I mean, God knows the representatives probably don't know either, because these things are so complicated. But imagine like 40 bills or whatever. Like, how would I even know what the right answer was for most of those things?
NPR has a broadcast a couple of days before the elections. They go over the pros and cons.
Oh, that's cool. I actually really like the ballot questions, but I think you would have to keep them to like a sort of manageable number. Although, I think it's usually like every legislative, there's one ballot question that's super contested, and everyone's like, oh, but like I'm not sure how to vote on this one. And we only have like 2 to 6 of them. Exactly.
Like California has like 50.
I know California has a lot, but I guess to Nick's point, like some things would work better than others. Like whether you have beer in the supermarket doesn't, I don't think, have a ton of like unintended consequences. It's more of just like a human, do you want them or not in your society? That seems like one that you could put to like a direct vote, because it's basically just people's opinion. Whereas like something about, I don't know, like housing or like zoning laws or something might be like super complicated.
In Virginia, they actually you have to get alcohol in a dispensary like they'd have in marijuana.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So like, so it's interesting. I guess part of this is like the question of like how transparent is the product? Like when I buy a computer, I can learn pretty quickly, like, was it a good computer? How is it working? If I vote for a representative, like how well do I actually know? Like whether what I wanted to have happen, what's happening through this person, it's actually really hard to tell.
And there's a lot of like exogenous factors.
Exactly.
For people at home, she's patting an Apple computer.
Oh.
And saying, oh, it's so easy when I buy a computer.
That's
I'll
true.
return you to your regular brush.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I guess if it's hard to use, that's information about what you bought.
So the point you're getting at is that when you can see what the product is more clearly, then people are less likely to get away with inefficiency.
Yeah, I guess to like bring it back to this conversation, if we're thinking of bureaucracy as a kind of inefficiency or something not working as we want it to, we've kind of been exploring like different things that make it more or less likely that an industry or a thing is going to be efficient.
Yeah.
And one of them is whether whoever's putting the pressure, the competitive pressure on you, can actually tell pretty transparently whether you're doing an efficient job.
Yeah.
And in politics, that's not so much the case. In like a lot of simple consumer goods, it is, and there's probably a spectrum even there. If you include things like environmental impact of the company, it again gets to be like really hard to tell. So it kind of depends on the thing, but that's another dimension.
We might want to be careful to distinguish between bureaucracy and bureaucratic inefficiency. Because we can hypothetically imagine efficient bureaucrations.
Well, I guess that's what I was wondering. Like, is bureaucracy, do we use that term when it's inefficient, and otherwise we just call it like the employees or like the staff?
I think you're right that we usually use the term bureaucracy when we're complaining about inefficiency.
I think so.
Right. Yeah, we use it to mean administrative complexity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and sometimes administrative complexity is like necessary. To some extent. So I guess I don't know if you wanted to talk about that aspect of it. But
I mean, like, to some extent you've got complex systems that need to be managed and administered.
Right.
And there's no way to manage them in a simple way.
For example, we just watched this thing about Chernobyl.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the problems with Chernobyl is that they were being more efficient on some dimensions because they didn't take the safety as big of a priority. And so like Chernobyl, unlike every other nuclear power plant, had very different procedures. Many of them meant to have you had way fewer safeguards, fewer redundancies. It was a lot cheaper. It was cheaper. But there was a lot of like, risk associated.
Really matter.
Yeah, exactly. So when you want to mitigate something else, then maybe you want this like administrative complexity, or you want redundancies built in to like mitigate risk. Another thing, what else was I listening to?
It's interesting because that failure was a combination of kind of complexity and inefficiency gone awry
True, yeah.
with maybe oversimplification of something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And not quite like accounting
Yeah.
for the risk and all these kinds
Yeah.
of things. So yeah, I guess in terms of like, what do you think of as bureaucracy? Like sometimes you have redundancy built in for a reason.
Right.
Another example that's sort of just fun is like, I was listening to this podcast about, is it the cosmic rays that like flip bits in
Yeah.
computers? So there were like some plane problems that happened because of this. Because it's when they started to have autopilot, I guess it would mess up the plane controls. These like cosmic, because you have more of them in the air. Literally, like cosmic rays from the sky can mess up a computer, flip a computer bit, and change the information.
Really?
Yeah, and so they have like now three systems have to agree basically,
Right.
so that the cosmic bit one over here gets flipped and the
Yeah.
other two aren't going to
Okay.
agree, or at least two
Right.
out of three,
Right.
yeah, something like that.
Basically,
So,
the atmosphere filters out
Yeah.
a lot of these rays, so you don't get these problems as much at ground level. But if you're on an airplane,
It's
there's
not
less
the
atmosphere.
It's the electromagnetic waves from the core of the planet create a barrier.
The magnetosphere.
Right.
yeah. Another example of this is just the way that the government is set up with checks and balances. Like you could have a dictator. From a certain perspective, a dictator is way more efficient. And instead we have all these like different divisions of power, and like this person has to get this person's approval, and this person can only do this, and that was set up intentionally to some extent to kind of mitigate the risk of too much power in one person's hands. So like that's bureaucracy.
What if the people are wrong? What if they keep voting for wrong things? What are you going to do?
Well, wait, no, how is that related to what I said?
It's just about dictators.
Oh, yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
No, but I mean, like, there's a lot of inefficiency, you could call it that, like, built in on purpose to our government,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
So,
I think
like,
that's
maybe
right.
that's an example of, like, bureaucracy that, in the big picture, maybe isn't inefficient for the goal of, like, a well-run society, because there's a bigger risk of, like, too much power.
Right. It serves an important purpose of moderating, how extreme changes can be. And
But not
stuff like
everyone
that.
agrees.
Yeah.
Like, some people think a dictator is better, like, because it does have inefficiencies in it.
Yeah.
And you see that with, like, the way that things happen when you're at war versus not, how the trade-offs change
Yeah.
with efficiency versus
What
these
would be another word for bureaucracy that's worth it?
Right.
I don't know. I think
Yeah,
it's the
it's a good
same
question.
word. I'm just trying to think about that. Organization.
Maybe green tape.
Green tape.
I think checks and balances.
Yeah,
checks and balances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess a lot of the
Yeah.
examples I just gave
Yeah.
are checks and balances.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get to the article.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I forgot that.
Yeah, So, Dan Moynihan. That's not. Wait, Patrick Moynihan was.
This
He's
is
dead. Okay,
Donald
then-
P. Moynihan.
Yeah.
So administrative burdens are an individual's experience of government as onerous. Red tape tends to focus more on the actual rules and not how people experience those rules. When you start to focus on people's experiences, you think not just about compliance costs of interacting with government, things like filling out forms, completing documentation, responding to requirements made by bureaucrats, but also the learning costs and psychological costs that arise when citizens engage with government.
I don't know why I think that's funny, but
What do you think?
it's true.
So-
I mean, I think of Kafka in the trial.
Yeah,
I think
I
about
was thinking about
that.
that.
The psychological costs that arise when
Yeah.
you engage with government.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess part of it is the difference between behind the scenes complexity and the complexity and hurdles that ordinary people face when interfacing with the system. Like, is the complexity in the interface or is it behind the scenes?
I think probably. Oh, right, because the interface, the one that you're interfacing with is built from behind the scenes,
Right.
and that's why it is complex.
I guess an
Right.
example where you have a big difference would be like like say a fairly inefficiently run private company probably still has like a decently efficient, easy face to the customer, but it might have like a lot of redundancy and like inefficiency in the way that it's operating internally.
Sure. Or maybe you
Yeah.
could even have complicated rules that are also important and need to be there,
Right.
but maybe the user doesn't need to see that. Like
Right.
from a programmer's perspective, it's like the difference between, the user interface, which needs to be really easy to navigate,
exactly.
and then maybe the complicated stuff that's going on in the program to make sure that everything's correct and
Right.
doing all the stuff that it's supposed to
And
do.
there's like the paper. There's all these like bills for the paper reduction act or whatever for programs, but they're really they're still complicated.
Interesting. Where they're trying to reduce like the amount of paperwork and stuff like that. Interesting.
Yeah, the paperless office. Where's that? That was a big thing in the 70s and 80s. We're getting to the paperless office.
Well, I think we're talking about paperwork in general, even if it's a digital paperwork. Or I don't know, are we?
Okay,
Or-
are we?
I'm not sure.
Are we?
I think maybe the bills are trying to. Is
Yeah.
it they're trying to reduce the use of paper or like just the number of forms you have to fill
I
out?
think it's the
Number of forms.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it can be online. It doesn't- It's not just paper.
It's metaphorical paper. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I read. Is that related to? I heard something about the Donald Trump administration when they came into office. They pledged to, for every new regulation they added, they had to find 2 other regulations and remove them. Yeah. So every time they add a regulation, it actually reduces the total number of
This is
regulations.
older than
Yeah.
that. I've seen that too. Like some government forms have a
Yeah.
little blurb about some act that says they have to sort of
Paper reduction.
justify
Mm,
making you fill out this form.
interesting.
I see.
Say why they need the information or something.
So do they have to write like 50 pages of documents to justify why you have to fill out?
Probably something like that.
Yeah.
Like, to read our
Yeah.
justification for why we're asking
Um,
this.
Yeah, it's the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1980.
Ah.
The federal law
1980,
designed
okay.
to reduce the total amount of paperwork burden that the federal government imposes on private businesses and citizens.
Ah.
It imposes procedural requirements on agencies that wish to collect information from the public.
Well, as with any regulation, it sounds great in theory, and then the question is, does it actually simplify things? Yeah.
I wanted to maybe give I don't know, a counterpoint or something.
Yeah.
Alex, you were talking about you could have an administrative system that was complex behind the scenes but presented a simple interface.
Yeah.
But that could still impose psychological costs. Like if let's say it's a really simple web form,
Yeah.
but you can't predict whether you're going to get approved or not. If it's unpredictable or if it seems arbitrary, that could still
Because you
be
don't know how those decisions are getting
anxiety
made.
producing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Not transparent.
Like I think about healthcare cost reimbursements. You can submit
Yeah.
a request to have this thing reimbursed, but it's very hard to predict.
Right.
Is it going to be reimbursed?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And I think there are a lot of social programs, especially where if you apply for them, whether you get in just depends on which person you get, who is the form handed to, who's making the decisions. And that's nerve-wracking and completely inconsistent. And maybe you apply 5 times, and on the 5th time you get the person who maybe you don't even change anything, and on the 5th person you get the person who says like, oh, this is reasonable or something like that. So that's certainly something you wouldn't have happen with basic income, because there's no one making any decisions. It's just, are you a citizen, and then you get it. But yeah, there's a lot of subjectivity involved in making decisions about social benefit programs. Not so much for Social Security. Social Security is also automatic. It's just, well, how much money did you make, and here's your
Or
benefit.
how old are you? Right,
Yeah, exactly. So it's nice when we can kind of eliminate subjectivity from some of these processes and eliminate kind of like indeterminate outcomes from
Well, the question that this election process is trying to answer for these benefit programs is a really difficult question
For the
to
what
answer.
programs?
For different benefit programs. It's like the question they're trying to answer is, I don't know, I'd have to think about it program for program, but does this person need it?
Right.
But also, do they deserve it?
Yeah.
It's sort of in
Yeah.
there too. And so it's very hard to have a straightforward criteria for that.
Yeah.
I mean, you could, but the way that people are even just framing the question is, I think, making it hard to have an efficient system.
Disability services are
Yeah.
an example of that. There's so much subjectivity and uncertainty. People who really need it and obviously deserve it are rejected routinely.
Yeah.
Like in the I, Daniel Blake, which is now on Netflix, with a
What is it
guy,
called? I, Daniel Blake?
Daniel Blake.
Uh-huh.
It's for us. Social in Britain, and the guy had all his doctors recommended he get the program, but the bureaucrats say they don't want him to get it. He has he has like this heart condition and he can't really do anything and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's
It's a
also
fiction
like
film,
what
to be
Nick was
clear.
saying, why did they make those decisions? So you just have to keep applying,
Right.
Yeah,
but
but
you
the guy
never know
doesn't-
how subjective it is.
Yeah, but the guy doesn't know how to use a computer and
Right,
things like
yeah,
that.
that's
So
another thing, yeah,
so it's
yeah.
really difficult for him to even get the program.
right.
And that goes back to like Bethany's point about like cheating. That like
Right.
we're so invested in like,
Yes.
well, like possibly like give
Right.
social services to like people who don't deserve
Exactly,
it,
right,
and that,
right.
that somehow we've decided that it's okay to be like, well, if a bunch of deserving people don't get it, like,
Right.
well, that's just a sacrifice we have to make.
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
undeserving people
Right.
Exactly.
don't get it.
It's like if you
Yeah.
think of one of those as if you think of those as errors, like which error do you weigh more? And like
Yeah.
it often seems like we weigh this error of like somebody who doesn't deserve it
Right.
gets it, like
It's
so much
worse.
more than all the
Oh,
people
yeah.
like who
Yeah.
deserve it not getting it,
Right.
Yeah.
which
And
is
then
really
the big
interesting.
irony is so many people can't apply, and they can't. The people who
Right.
need it don't know how to get it.
Yeah.
They have no idea how to get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the people who need it the most are often not the ones who are
Right.
able to navigate the system and
Exactly.
demonstrate that they need it.
Right, or pay somebody to do it for them. They
Yeah.
don't have the money. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting the way disability insurance works in this country, is that pretty customarily the first time you apply you're going to get rejected.
Yeah.
Kind of. I mean, like maybe occasionally some people get through on the first application, but it's really unusual. And then this whole industry of lawyers has popped up,
Yeah.
where they're happy to help people apply for disability because once that person gets the disability, they're also entitled to all the back pay from when they originally applied, and then the lawyer takes a cut of that.
That's right.
So you have this incentive to kind of, all these lawyers who do this, if disability were, it's kind of like the tax thing. Like if disability were suddenly like, oh, you applied, it's really easy to get, that kind of thing.
Right.
All these lawyers would lose their jobs, right?
Yeah.
So you've got these kinds of entrenched incentives there.
Totally.
Yeah.
Another thing that's like kind of at the heart of it, speaking of like basic income and how we talk about
Yeah.
here, is like what is the function? Like why do we have disability insurance instead of giving people basic income? If you want to like ask it that way, and like
Yes.
the implicit idea is supposedly that everybody's labor is like really needed,
Yeah.
so like only give it to people who really can't work, because you're not
Right.
losing out on anything anyway because they actually can't work, but we really need everybody else's labor. It's like we're at war. But then
Yeah.
like you're
Yeah.
not in a society like that, so it's not
Right.
like people are clamoring down the doors of everybody trying to get them to work, and that also probably makes the selection process really difficult. Like I've heard it, like a radio lab, for example, like in some places where the only jobs really require like a lot of like standing on your feet or like doing different things, then certain like back problems or other things might qualify you for disability.
Right.
Where in other places, if you could work sitting down, it wouldn't. There's just kind of like this. What is the qualification? Part of the problem is like the whole system is assuming people need everyone who can do some work is desperately needed. Like somebody
Right.
wants to pay them to do that,
Right.
and that's just not the world that people are living
Right.
in. So I'm not quite
But
maybe pinning it down, but it seems like that's
Yeah.
part of why it's hard to like actually have a selection criteria.
I think that's right, but it's also
Yeah.
interesting because even if you are living in that world, there's no reason why we shouldn't be using market incentives to get people to work. Like
Well,
if you
yeah,
want people
I
to
mean,
work,
obviously.
pay them,
Right.
and that incentivizes them to
well,
work.
there's also that.
right?
Yeah, I mean.
So instead, we have
yeah.
these two separate problems: like how do you get people to work, and
Right.
how do you ensure that they're being paid enough, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like it's
Right. Well, I
and
guess-
it's really three separate problems.
Also, part of
Yeah.
that is not that that's true. The expectation that everybody is needed and should be working, but part of it has to do with all the New Deal stuff and the FDR thinking about the kind of society we are,
Right.
and what kind of society are we. We don't want to make ill or weak or elderly or otherwise lesser members of the society, put them in positions.
Children used to work.
Yeah, and so, but are you that?
Right.
Then you have to prove that you're that.
Yeah,
But I mean,
exactly,
some of
right.
the thinking really is from that old kind of
Totally.
social consciousness
Yeah.
idea of
Yeah.
what makes a good society.
Right, I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
And I guess part of why I was bringing it up now that I'm thinking about, like, so the criteria, like, let's say that you have some kind of disability and you theoretically could do various jobs, but you're not ever going to get hired for them because somebody else is going to be the preferred person.
Right.
It's not that you couldn't do it, but like,
Yeah.
maybe you'd be a little slower or something. So no one's ever going to hire you. Like, if I'm trying to decide, I'm tasked somehow with trying to figure out, do you qualify
Yeah.
for disability? Like, what
Right.
is it? Is it that you reasonably could be expected to get a job? Is it that You see what I mean? And like if people were just clamoring desperately to pay you for that job, that would be, you know, you might not be applying, but
Well, one
Yeah.
county in Kentucky has figured out the disability thing. There's now 1 in 5 of the potential workers are on disability.
oh, interesting. Yeah.
Where's this, Kentucky?
The worst case is some county in Kentucky.
Yeah.
And it's disability, it correlates perfectly with the weak economy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So they've, you know, the doctors there have managed to turn it into basic income.
Right,
Right.
Give you an
exactly. Yeah.
excuse why you don't
Yeah.
work, and then you do get paid.
Exactly.
Yes, I
and
have read
so
about
it's
that,
been
and a lot of,
role. Yeah.
Middle-aged white males are getting, just living on disability.
Right.
In various parts of the country, because there aren't any jobs.
Yeah,
There aren't
exactly.
any jobs.
I mean, that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's not
Right.
quite interconnected.
Right.
And then, but then, like you were saying, from the personal perspective, you know, it's like you have to prove that there's something wrong with you that
Right.
you can't get a job.
Yes.
But actually, like the economy might just not have the job for you.
Right.
And
Well, you usually have to get a doctor's exam. I mean, it's more than
Right.
just, that itself is onerous. Just
yeah,
getting all the credentials that prove that you can't work
right.
is all by itself.
And then
huge.
your freedom is very much restricted once you're on disability,
Oh, yeah.
because if you start earning above a certain amount of money,
Yep.
your benefits are threatened
Yeah,
and that kind of
exactly.
thing. Yeah. So it's
And like, I mean, it's got so many problems, but just to take this
Yeah.
a little bit further, like actually, whether you're disabled in terms of being able to work, I mean, almost everyone could do something that someone theoretically might want to pay them some amount of money to do.
Yeah.
So it's like, what exactly is
Yeah.
this
Right.
line?
Right.
You know, and nobody is disabled from that perspective, but of course, lots of people realistically can't make a living in our current
Right.
economy, and what that means might be 1 in 5 actually in some places.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Well, and
what
if
is,
the only
you know,
jobs are coal mining, then
Yeah.
right, and then
everybody
maybe,
really is
Yeah.
disabled
Yeah,
with respect to coal mining.
right, and if the only jobs were certain kinds of jobs, then I would be disabled. I wouldn't have maybe the
Right.
physical strength or the height or whatever.
Right.
Like there's,
Right.
you know, it depends on what the jobs
So
are. Yeah.
to bring it back to basic income, to
Sorry.
to the extent
Yeah.
that disability insurance is being used to solve the problem that basic income
Right,
is
exactly.
supposed to solve, basic income is going to
Yeah.
reduce the administrative burden, is going to reduce the red tape
Yeah.
in our society. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think from the people I know, at least, a lot of people would prefer to have the basic income than to have to try to go through the many cycles of
Oh, yeah.
attempting to.
And it's also true that because, you know, even if you keep all the other programs in place, if you give people a basic income, then it lessens the overall amount of administrative burden they have to undergo per unit of benefit they receive.
Yeah.
Because now they're getting benefit from the basic income, and now it's less critical that
Right.
that they maybe get benefit from these other programs, or maybe they have more resources available
Used
to them
do it,
to
right.
be
Yeah,
able
you can,
to
like, buy
yeah,
a computer and like research it.
exactly
figure it out,
exactly.
get them, yeah.
Don't
So
you
I think
though that
Yeah.
if it became the rule of the country to have basic income, that
Yeah.
people would want to not have the other services?
I think in the long run, we might come to the realization that some of these other services just aren't necessary anymore.
Depend on the amount. of
Yeah.
people
It depends on the
come
amount.
But it's not something that needs to happen like, oh, we implement basic income and you know, it's going to replace all these other
I know
programs. Like that
for
doesn't need to
people
happen at once.
talk
A lot of people
about it
talk
that
about that.
way,
I
yeah.
don't think it's particularly useful to think about it that
Right.
way. I think the reason they do sometimes is because they're trying to make the numbers add up. They're
Right.
trying to balance the budget, that
Right.
kind of thing.
Or like
But-
if those things
yeah.
are means tested, a basic income might put you above the qualifying mark. or
Sure.
something.
I mean, and I think that's fine too. Like
It's high
you're
enough.
getting so much money that you don't qualify for these other programs anymore, and everybody's getting that money. So
Yeah.
there's no,
that
you know,
seems
like
more
yeah.
natural than like phasing them out or like forcing them to end or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But I don't know. I don't know the details of them. So, and it
Yeah.
depends on the program. Like a clean needle program doesn't need to end because there's basic income, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
one
And-
might reduce the need for the other, but they're not. One's
Right.
not really providing money
Right.
exactly. So
Right.
even a soup kitchen, like we talked about, people who
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, for whatever reason they spend their basic income on something and then they still need food. Like, you know, you might find that some of the social services
You might
are still
find that,
needed and
yeah.
some of them aren't. And
Let's find out. Let's see what
Yeah.
happens.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to another quote. So this is talking about Social Security. People think of it as a straightforward program, just cutting checks to people. But in fact, the government has to track hundreds of millions of people's earnings over their entire lifetimes.
That is really cool.
It's not actually administratively simple to do that, but bureaucrats figured out a way to do it so that it's simple for the beneficiaries.
Right.
To some extent, it's a function of the universality and popularity of the program. But the program is so popular not just because most people contribute and most people benefit. It's also true that the original bureaucrats who actually implemented this program in the late 1930s were cognizant of the fact that if they made it difficult for people to enroll, the program at the time was actually not especially popular, that it would threaten the program itself. One of the reasons why the program survived and thrived is in part because the government kept administrative burdens in the program pretty low.
That's right, and that has to do with the special feature that it was being funded by the new people signing up at the time, probably, or just that it would be too unpopular?
It had to, so they're talking about the universality and the popularity, but they're saying that if the administrative burden was too high, then it would become even less popular and easier to justify doing away with. Yeah, because if it's something that goes to everyone, and everyone's like experiencing this really difficult thing to kind of deal with, and everyone's going to be like, come on, what's going on?
It's like DMV.
Right, yeah. Right. Although the DMV's managed to hold on to inefficiency for pretty long, so.
I actually haven't been there in a long time.
I guess
they're that inefficient.
Well, you haven't been there because you're doing it online now.
Yeah, so that's
so
good.
There you go. Yeah.
I mean, you do have to go there every 10 years, actually.
Yeah, and it's actually gotten a lot better. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this is an important point that if something is universal, so that everyone is seeing it, everyone is experiencing it, and you've minimized the administrative burden, then that can lead to it being something that's going to be hard to reverse. And I highlighted this because I'm thinking basic income. Like what are the parallels here? And I think that's right. I think if you make it very, very simple for people to interface with. And the fact that it's universal, I mean, like it's going to be hard to get rid of.
Yeah.
Some people are afraid of that. Some people are afraid that once the basic income is in place, we can't get rid of it, and it's going to ruin the economy, and we're screwed, or something like that. Yeah.
When they started, Social Security was issuing a number to every American. Was that thought to be an invasion of privacy or totalitarian? Or?
Yeah, it was controversial.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's in the next paragraph, actually.
Yeah. They came up with Social Security numbers, which was a completely new and controversial innovation at the time, but it allowed the state to track people's earnings without putting pressure on the individual to do that. Yeah. And I think we've mentioned here before that there were a lot more, during World War II, there were a lot more deaths of Jews in Holland than there were in Germany, because Holland had a very efficient citizen tracking system.
Per capita death of Jews, not like
per capita, yeah. So it can be scary anytime the government's tracking you. Can that like anytime you have a technology that's very powerful, if it gets into the wrong hands, it can be used to do harm.
I read an article on the BBC that there's this book in Holland, and not in Canada, about all the ancestry of Jews in the U.S. and North America, and this German professor was trying to get it back to Germany, so that when they conquered the U.S. and Canada and whatever, that they could track down all the Jews and kill them off.
Wow.
Just like on the what is it, the leader in High Castle or whatever it is, White Castle in
High Castle.
Man at High Castle, yeah.
On Amazon.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, I think a lot of bureaucracy can be removed. Red tape can be removed if you're willing to deal with a lot of more surveillance.
Yeah.
Right.
And it seems like these days is a good time to wonder for people to decide how much privacy they really want.
Yeah.
Other nations are, like China, are on the verge of total surveillance, and so then it'd just be the cameras and tracking and computers can fill in all the forms for you, and you don't have to do any red tape at all.
But your economy actually becomes more efficient because you have all that much more data to go through, and your AI becomes that much more powerful if you have all the information.
Right. So this is kind of that like power versus efficiency thing that we're talking about with the formation of the government too. Yeah. Those checks and balances versus efficiency. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, I'll acknowledge that basic income avoids red tape without requiring
Tons of
Orwellian
Yeah, right.
surveillance.
Right. The only thing you need to track is that there's a person there who needs a basic income.
Yeah.
And you could certainly implement it in a way where you can't track how people spend their money, but you could also do it in a way that does.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You said a person there that needs money, but it's actually any person, right? You said that they just track that there's a person there who needs money, but actually it's any person.
Right. The fact that they're a person there means
Yeah.
that they need money because everyone gets a basic income. Yeah.
But there is, there's this episode of like X-Files where the guy puts his father in the attic, and his father's corpse in the attic, and then he gets his father's Social Security.
I don't remember that.
That doesn't feel like a very X-File-y
No, I
X-File.
don't remember that.
But the guy had a tail, and he was able to morph himself and things.
Okay. All right. There you go.
Yeah. Exactly. It seemed like just a normal thing a person doing. Not normal.
It was just
Yeah,
an
like otherwise it feels like a
basic
nightly
income
news
related
Exactly.
episode.
Yeah.
Tax fraud.
Exactly. Tax.
Like I'm
Yeah.
just collecting my dead person's
Exactly.
Social
Social
Security
Security.
benefits or something.
Yeah.
which is a problem for basic income also.
Yeah. People collecting each
Identity
other's.
theft.
And shape-shifting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you don't want to pay it out to people who are dead and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And if someone shapeshifts into looking like Alex, can they get his basic income?
Yeah, what if he shapeshifts into 5 different people at different times? Yeah.
But yeah, it is like at the conference, someone was working on this problem of like unique identification and how to deal with that. Yeah, at the conference in New York.
Oh,
Last
okay,
weekend,
yeah.
or last week, yeah.
You can have like fingerprints and things like that, but
Yeah.
then there's like in Gattaca where they had the false fingerprint and they had the blood underneath
yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
Right.
It's really easy to generate fake fingerprints.
Is it?
Yeah.
and
Oh, you have to, yeah, it is. All you have to do is generate an image and, like...
yeah, like plastic molds of your fingerprint or whatever, and you can glue it on.
I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about generating an image of a fingerprint
Like a fake one that doesn't exist.
that doesn't correspond to a real person or
And
anything,
you
yeah.
can, and you could probably do it with contact lenses and put.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't work, but there's like you can have the veins, and there's like a company in Japan that wants to do that. I talked about it a while ago.
Yeah.
I think that the tricky thing about any biometrics is that it's all data, and data can be compromised. Like you can get someone else's iris scan or DNA or something like that. It's not there's no 100% guaranteed way to identify unique people who are alive, who are citizens, etc. We've got to kind of like do the things that we do to kind of like check people's identity and that kind of thing, and it's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be some level of fraud, and even if you have a basic income account and it's completely verified and completely legitimate, once you have the account, what's to stop you from giving the credentials to that account to someone who pointed a gun at your head or something like that? So there's all this kind of
But
stuff.
I guess these are not like entirely new problems, right? 'Cause
No.
similar things with my bank account or anything
Yeah.
else. Right.
And the point I like to make
Or
about
Netflix has less
my
tight
account,
security than
right, and the point I like to make about this is that although you can't 100% solve this problem so that there are never any issues, we already have the systems that allow us to do it well enough so that the level of fraud is below the level that would cause the whole system to collapse or something like that. So I don't think it's a serious issue that we're going to face with basic income that hasn't come up before or something like that. Like we know how to do this stuff, or the government knows how to do this stuff well enough.
And assuming that you have a basic income that allows people a certain level of thriving, like the motivation for this is going to go way down.
That's true.
That like
For stealing.
the motivation of people to like put a gun to your head to get to your bank account is really high,
Right.
like because there's like a high level of poverty and desperation.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
But like if everyone is like, okay, I'm basically thriving, like maybe we have some people who are just like, well, for the lulz, I just want to try to game the system and see how many,
Yeah.
you know, like basic incomes I can hack into.
Yeah. Some people would try
But,
to get
like,
rich. There's always somebody, right?
But then
Yeah.
that gets back to like you're cheating.
Yeah,
Question of
exactly.
like, well, okay, is it worth
Right.
like what level of burden is worth trying to prevent
Exactly.
like the 0.01%
Yeah.
of that? But I think for the most part, people will be like, okay, cool, I'm thriving.
Right.
Like I'm gonna go like figure out how to, you know, like do woodworking or
Exactly.
you know, garden, or like I'm not gonna spend my time like trying to hack into someone else's basic income account. Whereas, you know, previously I might have like tried to put a gun to someone's head to get their bank account because
Right.
that was a
Right.
relatively, you know, low cost way for me to get some money they didn't have any other access
Yeah.
to. But no, so the choices that people are making now, like they're in a different set of
That's a good
constraints than they
point.
would
Yeah.
be.
That's a good point.
And I think also that an important difference between the basic income and a bank account is the bank account has all this money right now, whereas the basic income, if you coerce someone into giving you their basic income or get it or hack them and get their basic income account, eventually they're gonna, you know,
Report it stolen.
report it and say like, hey, I'm not getting a basic income. Maybe it's because I gave it to this other person, or, you know, like maybe he paid me for this or whatever, but I'm not getting my basic income. And, you know,
Right.
if we make it easy for people to report and say that, you know, like it's a crime to take someone's basic income, but not a crime to sell your basic income or something like that, then
Right.
then we can adjust the incentives so that it's really, really hard to get someone else's basic
That would be
income.
really smart, actually.
Yeah.
That would
Yeah.
be a smart way to do it.
Yeah.
Because then you just try to sell it and then you report them and then the whole thing collapses and nobody can try to buy.
Right. They'd have to either be really good at like threatening you that they're going to come after you if you report
Right.
them, or they have to like kill you or something. I don't
Again,
know,
like,
which
none
comes
of
with
this
its
is
own.
anything new. Like there's other
Yeah.
kinds of fraud
Yeah.
that people could theoretically,
Yeah.
like people could try to do this with
Right.
current situations.
I think people worry kind of irrationally worry more about this with basic income than they need to, because it's kind of something that like these kinds of things happen.
Yeah, in fact, it's like
Yeah.
less of a problem with basic income, like you said, than
Right,
some
like
pile of money, and people aren't as desperate, so it's like
Right. Yeah.
That's a good point.
And we do see a lot of this kind of fraud with food stamps, but a big part of that is because people are selling their food stamps because they want to buy other things.
Yeah, I don't know if I think
Yeah.
of it as fraud versus like
Yeah.
corrections to an inefficient system, because you're giving them a non-fungible thing.
I mean, it's using fraud to correct an inefficient system.
because you're not supposed to sell the food stamps.
Well, yeah, it's against the rules. Yeah.
But the rules are stupid, and so
Rules are
yeah.
stupid.
Right, but there's an incentive like built in to want to
Right.
sell your food stamps.
Yeah, to be like, oh, like
yeah.
you can't get like diapers with your food.
Right,
stamps. You're like, okay,
exactly.
so I can feed my child, but like after I feed them, there's something that's gonna
Yeah,
happen.
exactly.
So,
There's
Yeah.
another side of this. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Good point.
All right, here's the next quote. Learning costs are essentially finding out about a program, realizing there's a program out there that can help you. For example, with a program like Medicaid that provides health insurance for people with low incomes and people with disabilities, you have to know that the program exists, and you have to have some idea that you might be eligible for it. So this is an important thing that basic income just doesn't have. Like, you don't have to apply for it. You don't have to, find out that you're eligible. It's something that everybody around you is getting, and if you don't know that you're getting it, you're going to find out that
You're gonna know.
getting it.
Yeah,
You're going to know.
exactly. You're
Yeah.
gonna be like, wait a second.
And kind of to Nick's point earlier that, like if you apply for something and you don't even know if you're going to get it, and that's kind of inconsistent, that goes away with basic income. Yeah. So obviously, if we're talking about healthcare and we have universal healthcare, single payer healthcare or something like that, then again, that solves the problem, right? You don't have to know whether you're eligible or anything like that. It's just something that you get. There are other complexities in the healthcare system that won't be directly addressed by that, but it's certainly a start. And anytime you have something that's universal that goes to everyone, it eliminates this problem of having to learn about it. It's just part of life.
Yeah.
It's part of
And the second thing that you might have also pulled out, the stigma thing, also goes away if everybody gets it.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. So here's another one. Jumped to the end of the article here for this one. Historically, in the social welfare example, you're looking at sometimes half of people not being on programs when they're eligible. That's a bigger impact oftentimes than an incremental expansion of eligibility. The US government does know how to deliver services and provide benefits in the least burdensome way. It's just that we don't always do it. So yeah, a lot of times when we're talking about these policies, we're arguing about who's eligible and all of that. But
Right.
but sometimes, you know, it's, I mean, a lot of times it's not even going to the people
A
who
lot
are
of the
eligible
eligible
anyway.
people.
Yeah.
I sent you an article about Prospera, a program in Mexico that the World Bank and things like that always point to, but they're phasing it out because it's
Yeah.
so inefficient, and they, like, people who shouldn't get it actually are getting it, and people who don't get it should be getting it. And so
Yeah.
it's like only a third of the people who should get it do. But all these other people do get it.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It's not an easy problem to solve if you're trying to do like a targeted benefit.
Yeah.
It's
it is.
hard to target it.
It is.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Even if you wanted to do it well.
It could be
And-
really hard to like find the right people
Yeah.
and tell
and,
them about it, and
and there's a lot of incentives not to do it well.
of course, yeah.
So you know, the fewer people who accept it, the cheaper the program is, that kind
Well,
of
like
thing.
you can have
Yeah.
more programs on the books with greater eligibility for the same budget if half the people aren't taking the money. So that may look
Yeah.
better as a politician,
Yep.
right? Because it's like, oh, we have this eligibility that's expanded, for example,
Yeah.
but half the people
We
aren't
don't
getting it.
pay
And
it. We're not
assuming
paying.
you were budget constrained, you'd have to like reduce the eligibility otherwise, which makes you look much worse
Yeah.
if everybody was taking it.
I know a way we can afford this bold new welfare program. All we have to do is make this form a little more complicated in this other program. That will
Exactly,
save us
right.
some money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Problem solved.
Yeah, exactly.
But really,
Yeah.
the optics can, I mean, and this comes back to the problem we were talking about like, how does the voter even know if they're
Yeah.
getting what they
Yeah.
want? And like, even if you as a voter really care about these programs, like, the optics to you, it might look like they're doing more if they have more of these programs
Right.
with greater eligibility. And
You're
how
not-
the heck do you even know
Yeah.
who's...
You're not voting on how complicated the form is, and you're
Right.
not. That's not even
Yeah.
something that you even necessarily know about.
And it's probably
Yeah.
really hard for anybody, even an expert who's motivated, to get the data on exactly how many people are eligible versus sign up for it. So,
Yeah.
like, how can the voter easily take that into account? It's not-
Yeah, I think a lot of times when they're measuring the effects of these programs and doing studies and stuff like that, they're not looking at, how complicated the form is. They're just
Right.
looking at, okay, what are the distributional effects, and, like,
Yeah.
how are people responding, and, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, we'll do one more.
Oh, yeah, that was the one I just...
Yeah, this is psychological costs get overlooked, which are things like stigma. People might feel uncomfortable admitting that they use food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or just the amount of stress that's involved for people when they're trying to navigate programs. Yeah, and I mean, like, personally, I feel like if there's something where I kind of know I probably should do it, but I don't know what the outcome is going to be, or if it's going to be worth it in the end, like, I'll put that off. Like, it's just not.
And if you're really crunched for time and all that stuff too, like, it's really hard.
On the
Yeah.
other hand, if you really need something,
You do
and you still, to Nick's point, you don't know what's going to happen behind the scenes.
Right.
It's very stressful.
Yeah.
You're waiting for that to happen because you absolutely need
Yeah,
it.
and and maybe even sometimes you need it so badly that you don't want to subject yourself to finding out that you're not going to get it.
Yeah. Right.
So you just
Don't
want
do
to hold in your mind that, okay, maybe if I go through this process, I'll
Worst
be able to
comes
get
to
this
worst,
thing.
I'll do
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the stigma thing is really important too. I suspect some percentage of the people who are eligible and don't do it could be because of the stigma.
I think some
Yeah.
people feel that way. Yeah.
And I think there's also this idea that I need it right now, but by the time I go through the process and qualify for it, I'm planning to be out of it anyway.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
and then by actually applying, I'm admitting that I'm
Yeah.
not going to put the
Right.
effort in, or I'm giving up, or something like
Definitely.
that. Yeah.
There's a lot of stigma depending on the part of the country too. I
Yeah.
think that in some parts of the country, the stigma is greater. Like people who don't want unemployment insurance because they feel that makes them lazy, or that characterizes them as lazy because they don't have a job, or
Yeah.
welfare in general.
Yeah.
They don't want that. They don't want that as part of their character, which is pretty sad.
Like my great grandfather, he during the Depression, he didn't want the dried milk or whatever because the Native Americans don't accept benefits or something.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Right. And standing in line for any kind of welfare or unemployment insurance, I mean, during the 30s and all of that, that was shameful
Right.
for a lot of people, really shameful. Yeah, why can't you do it? Why can't you do it?
Right.
Can't you do it yourself?
Yeah.
Depend on the government to do
Right,
it?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, if you spent so much time judging other people for accepting those benefits, and then you have to show up there yourself,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh
yeah.
man.
Oh, it's really humiliating. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one way to deal with this, I mean, basic income deals with this because everybody gets it,
Right.
so it's kind of obvious. But
Yeah.
another way to deal with this, I suppose, if you were offering other kinds of programs, is to make them as anonymous as possible. So, like, because many more people will sign up if you're not like physically standing in line,
Right.
or you get to pay with cash, not like
Right.
with something that's clearly identified as different, or
Yeah.
you know. These kinds
Yeah,
of things.
I mean that's a good point. Like EBT cards, people know what they look like, and
Right.
you know you
What's
can,
like a debit card?
What's EBT?
electronic benefits transfer. It's what you get your food stamps on.
Oh, okay.
and there are also
Interesting.
some direct cash
Right.
benefits that come on those
Even
cards.
if you just made them look like a regular card, like that would really help with the stigma, I think.
Yeah.
Because just that moment in the supermarket, you know.
And
Make them look like a regular card, and then there's also the issue of sometimes you bought a bunch of stuff and some of it qualifies for food stamps and
Oh,
some of
no.
it doesn't. So then the cashier has to say,
Yeah.
okay, and your remaining balance is, and then you
Right,
have to get out your
right.
real
Oh,
debit
yeah.
card, and
Yeah.
yeah.
You can have it transferred onto your regular account,
yeah.
your regular bank account.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the
Sort of like
solution
a
there
basic income, yeah.
would be to have one debit card that is connected to an account that has your food stamps money, but you can also put regular money on it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah,
and then
smart.
behind the scenes, it just pays,
It
pays
does
for
the-
both.
that would
kind
be-
of thing.
Eliminates the
Yeah.
judgment in line
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you're buying potato chips instead of something nutritional.
Well, you can actually buy
People
potato
get mad
chips with
about
food
that
stamps. Oh, because they'll see that you got food stamps because you bought something. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
All right, so let's get some final thoughts. Bureaucratic inefficiency, red tape, basic income. Go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm still curious about is like how much of the pressures towards inefficiencies would change with a basic income, and not specifically in the basic income program, but in the other, in not just government, but also companies. I think any large organization has some
Yeah.
degree of this challenge. Yeah, so I'm interested in that, and I guess I'm also liked the discussion around the trade-offs. But sometimes it's just inefficient. You'd like to figure it, but sometimes there's a trade-off between other kinds of risk and other kinds of efficiency, which we talked about
Yeah.
in here.
Yeah.
Whether it be like a lot of power in the hands of somebody, or the risk of like a nuclear meltdown or whatever
Right,
it is. So
right,
those kind of
yeah.
interesting discussions.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything more to say.
Okay.
Yeah, I really hope the basic income will help ease the anxiety of people in Massachusetts, and they'll lighten up about beer.
They'll all want a celebratory.
And I think it will. I think it will.
Yeah,
You don't like the packies? The packies? That's what we call them here.
They're fine.
Yeah.
What are the packies?
Package stores.
Oh,
In Massachusetts,
right.
they call them packies.
Steve.
When my wife bought a new car a while ago, the dealer did all the RMV paperwork. So on the one hand, there was a lot of red tape. On the other hand, the invisible hand of the market managed to solve all my wife's bureaucracy problems. The old plate, the new plate, the
Yeah,
old car, they threw in all the solutions. So
Yeah. Some of them do
I don't
that.
see how everybody can benefit from a market-based solution to their red tape problems, but it worked for my wife.
That's nice.
Can't really think of anything.
Okay. Elizabeth?
Oh, yeah, additional thoughts.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think Bethany's question is the important question. When we have a basic income in place, how much inefficiency is it going to eliminate elsewhere in the economy? And I guess another way of framing this question is how much of the kind of useless, unnecessary work that people are doing, how much of that is a result of the fact that we're trying to create incomes for people? And my hunch is that it's a lot of it. I think there's always going to be some inefficiency in various places, but in terms of the unnecessary jobs, as soon as we stop trying to target employment with our economic policies and we start, raising interest rates and, inefficient businesses start failing and, that kind of thing, we're going to eliminate a lot of that problem. Okay, thanks guys. Great discussion.
Thanks, yeah.
Next week we're talking about the Green New Deal,
Oh.
which is like the New Deal but greener.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great. I wonder if I got a ticket. I
Did
didn't
you ever
work on this at
find out?
home. No, I never could figure it out. It kept putting me in Colorado, so
Oh
I
no.
couldn't figure out what's going on,
That's
but
too
I
bad.
didn't have time.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Hopefully you don't have a ticket.
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
hopefully. Because now you made the effort of parking somewhere you're supposed to
And-
park.
But now you know.
There-
Maybe I should go to the bank and get a roll of quarters.
Quarters.
Yeah.
I've got so many quarters at home. I wasn't planning to park there. I was going to
Right.
do my usual parking.
Oh, yeah.
Then I, at the last minute, thought, I'll try something legal
Yep.
change.
And then where did it get